It is my distinct pleasure and Sarah's distinct disappointment that I'm introducing her. I told her to shorten her presentation because I'm going to be talking for so long about how great she is. So my name's Mina. I'm the Associate Member Chair, and Sarah is the Secretary of the OCAMPR Board. She is the longest standing member on our current board. That's true. So she might not be the president, but she is the senior OCAMPR board member. And
I've never thought about that until right now.
You're the OG.
I have some institutional values too.
So I think all of her professional accomplishments and personal accomplishments as a chaplain are echoed in our personality as a board of, misfits and freaks and people that come together and say, I don't feel at home anywhere else, and I love it here. So as a chaplain at Mass General Hospital, you can imagine it's a very politically charged environment that does not always listen to our caring Orthodox voices, and she speaks out of that experience as a chaplain and as a person who experiences challenging situations. So I've learned a lot from Sarah. She's an author, presenter, a leader of many different communities and sub-communities. So I look forward to learning a lot from her this afternoon, and I hope you're excited as I am.
Thank you all for being here, and of course this topic is something, sometimes I do presentations on subjects I want to learn more about because it forces me to kind of like do a literature review and just tap into it. So I certainly do not have the final word on any of this, but as a person who's been working with people with serious illness and hospice and the dying, this is something I encounter, and I think our tradition, like pretty much with everything, has a beautiful way of providing us tools to think about this and to navigate in our own lives. And since the goal of OCAMPR is to look at kind of quote unquote secular, although again, as Deacon Nash said, it's not like secular versus sacred, common ways, popular ways of looking at things like anxiety or death awareness or fear of death, to bring that into dialogue with our rich practices as Orthodox Christians. So I hope this will be conversation. I will definitely leave time for us to talk because I want to hear your experiences. And so I look forward to sharing that. This is a little picture of kind of who I am. That's my husband, Peter. That's our son, Raphael. There I am with my palliative care team at Massachusetts General Hospital. And it's like social worker, me as a chaplain. That was the second week of the COVID pandemic. And that's when we started rounding as a team for the first time ever in the history of palliative care at Mass General. And so social work, chaplaincy, 2 physicians, Eric Krakauer, who's like the global palliative medicine, like most famous, amazing human being actually, and then 2 fellows. And there I am on the left with one of our patients. So I'm very involved in the Association of Professional Chaplains. I'm endorsed by the Antiochian Archdiocese, which is basically like a blessing from your community to endorse you as a practicing chaplain with training and with the CPE. And right now I'm doing half-time research, half-time clinical work through the Cambia Health Fellowship. And I'm studying spiritual care integration in inpatient palliative care teams. I'm doing a big mixed methods study. What's kind of funny in light of what Mina said too is actually I learned after my grant is done December 1st, my position's actually going down to half-time. And because Mass General is not really a place that likes to have lots of chaplains, unfortunately. But I feel like God is opening a space for me to kind of actually hopefully do more work within the church, more things with OCAMPR as we continue to grow. So, and obviously I'm secretary here, and I newly will be a sessional assistant professor at St. Vladimir's for the Doctor of Ministry program. So I'm very excited. Thank you. to class is ministry to the sick and dying. So I feel pretty comfortable with that, but I'm excited. Oh, thank you. That's very kind. So we have some objectives. So I'd love to just talk about death anxiety as a concept. Some people call it fear of death, but like in the literature, it's referred to as death anxiety. So that's why I'm using that term. We can talk about a little bit about religiosity and death anxiety, and then just looking at kind of our Orthodox framework for navigating it, some tools and the practices and the beliefs we have are really a way to navigate this. And I guess if there's one thing I want to emphasize, it's that I want us, and I know I need to, think about this as a practice, as faith as a practice. We practice over and over and over. There are times when I have moments of fear of death and times when I feel overwhelmed about the uncertainty of death, all these pieces. There are other times, most of the time, when I look back on my work being with patients as they die at the time of death. I've been with many, many people at the moment of death, and I've seen so many beautiful deaths. I've seen so many incredibly beautiful, unexplainable, mysterious moments of being with people. And so for me, that is such a consolation and it reminds me that I don't need to understand everything. Instead, we pray, we do our best. I think about the thief on the cross, Jesus, remember me in your kingdom. I think about all those things. And so for me, this is not about solving anything or even arriving to a place where we know everything, but instead revisiting constantly what we have been given in the church together. Okay, so why does this matter? So this is a picture that I love. This is actually my patient on Bigelow 13 in Mass General. This was a patient that I had. So why does death anxiety matter? Well, this is actually more of a talk about why spiritual screening needs to be done with every palliative care patient, but that's the subject of my research. But this was a patient we had, I'll call him John, who had come in and out. He had cancer, had been treated, it was in remission, then he was back and forth, as you know how it often goes. When I learned more about him, I thought, sounds like someone that could use spiritual care. He's having some spiritual distress. My colleagues were like, no, he's not religious. You don't need to go see him. This happens to us all the time. Who has had that happen? Chaplains up in here? Yeah. Mm-hmm. They're not religious. You don't need to see them. Turns out that was wrong. And also, oof. But long story short, the next time he came in, one of our physicians who's a super awesome devout Catholic said, you need to go see John. So I go there, and not only was he having spiritual distress, he was Greek Orthodox. Hello. So in any case, I could have met him a year before. I only met him as he was really entering into the final phase of his life. What I found is that he was really afraid of death. He was a lonely person. He was a kind, gentle, sweet person. He loved to garden. He lived by himself. He didn't have a lot of people kind of to be with him. And as he was dying, he was alone. And I knew he was afraid, but I also, not that I could have fixed this, I just want to be so clear. But I do think it would have been nice for him to talk to me about some of these things, and I would have liked to give him some space to talk about that in a shared framework, our shared worldview as Orthodox Christians. And what happened is, when people begin the actively dying phase, it's kind of this moment where you're not going to be coming back, you're not going to be waking up, you enter into this space. It can take 3 hours, it can be 2 weeks. With him, it was 2 weeks. He was actively dying for literally 2 weeks. No food, a little bit of water just with his medication. He had intractable pain. He had a lot of suffering. And it was so hard for the staff. And all I could think to myself was as he was actively dying, he was wrestling with a lot. And my hope is that he was doing, some of that spiritual work was happening, and I hope that he found peace at the end. But I felt so sad, because I felt like this was an example of when you have these fears and these anxieties and these unresolved things, it really can draw out your dying process. Sometimes we've all seen that. I see heads nodding. So it matters. It matters for one person, right? It matters for everyone. But just this one person, him wrestling with this anxiety and this fear of death, fear of the unknown, was really hard. And so I hope that we can bring these things to light when we care for our patients earlier, not right at the end. So death anxiety, objective 1. So according to the APA, death anxiety is defined as emotional distress and insecurity aroused by reminders of mortality, including one's own memories and thoughts of death. Classic psychoanalytic theory asserted that the unconscious cannot believe in its own death, therefore thanatophobia was a disguise for some deeper fear. Existentialists later proposed that death anxiety is at the root of all fears, though often disguised, right? It manifests in different ways. A massive research using self-report scales suggests that most people have a low to moderate level of death anxiety. Okay. Here's some key reference texts that are like the kind of like, you know, the foundational texts. Of course, Denial of Death by Ernest Becker is it, you know, everyone needs to read that book. Hopefully you all have read it or will read it now. Irvin Yalom, who we love, and CPE, right? Shout out, and Yalom, and systems and groups and all these things, just such a, I mean, really amazing. And then most recently, Sheldon Solomon, who is like actually the AAHPM, Hospice and Palliative Medicine, is doing a presentation about death anxiety next month, and Sheldon Solomon's one of the co-presenters. But he and his colleagues have written about this book called The Worm at the Core on the role of death in life. So again, I think it's important to read all these books and know what people are talking about in dialogue with our own framework. Okay, here's a quote from Becker. What does it mean to be a self-conscious animal? The idea is ludicrous, if it is not monstrous. It means to know that one is food for worms. Happy worms. This is the paradox. He is out of nature and hopelessly in it. He is dual, up in the stars, and yet housed in a heart-pumping, breath-gasping body that once belonged to a fish and still carries the gill marks to prove it. Man is literally split in two. He has an awareness of his own splendid uniqueness and that he sticks out of nature with a towering majesty, and yet he goes back into the ground a few feet in order to blindly and dumbly rot and disappear forever. It is a terrifying dilemma to be in and to have to live with. To live a whole lifetime with the fate of death haunting one's dreams and even the most sun-filled days. That's something else. So, I think when everyone reads that, you all go like, at least I do. I thought, oh, oof. And of course, if that is your entire worldview, of course that would be something else and overwhelming, and I wouldn't know how to navigate any of that. Of course, for us as Orthodox Christians, we don't see ourselves as literally split in two. We are not a spirit that assumes some flesh and then we go back to the dirt. Instead, we are always, we are incarnate beings, body, mind, soul. We don't separate the things. We really see ourselves as a holistic person, right? Hypostasis. And we always refer ourselves back, our sense of self, back to Christ. But I just wanted you to know that this quote exists because it's very powerful. So, what does death anxiety look like? What is it about? So, it comes in different ways. So some of it can be fear of death as like a philosophical concept. How do we think about death, and looking at the philosophers and the great thinkers? You can have anxiety about your own death. I'm not ready to die. You worry about the impact on your loved ones if you do die. You're worried about missing out on experiences, right? Anticipatory grief about what you won't see. You could be worried about the process of dying, the dying experience itself. Will you be in pain? Will you be suffering? So the process leading up to dying. You may be kind of focused on needing to control or prevent death. It comes across as fear of the unknown, or just a fear of nothingness, right? That deep feeling of nothingness. So I just want us to remember that when we hear about this or think about this with the people we care for, it comes from different places, like there's nuance to it, right? Some early experiences, they say, that contribute to death anxiety could be overprotective or underprotective caregivers, as like when you're a child, caregivers with anxious behaviors, experiencing or witnessing physical harm, traumatic loss, understandably, hearing about catastrophic deaths, obviously violence, or on the opposite side, never talking about death ever. I interviewed a person for my book about grief, and he shared that although he was raised in a devoutly Orthodox Christian environment, went to church, super involved, he had never been to a funeral until he attended his own father's funeral at age 26. that was not good for him. That was traumatic in its own way because he had never seen a dead person, and the dead person was his dad. So I have a lot of theories about that, but I think one thing is bring your kids to funerals if you can. Try to, and I'll say an aside, I brought my son to his first Orthodox funeral. It was his new Naz father, who he had met a few times, but I brought Rafa, who's 10, to the funeral, and I chanted the funeral with some colleagues, friends, and we venerated the body. And afterwards I said, Rafa, how was that for you? It's sometimes it can be a little bit intense seeing someone who's died. And he goes, well, it was nice to see what he looked like. That's what he said. He was just like, it was good to see what Nuna's dad looked like. He thought it was, he wasn't scared at all. He was just very like, okay, yeah, that was Nuna's dad, okay. So I'd like to think that normalizing that can be something very comforting. So here's the way, many ways, and this is not an exhaustive list, about manifestations of death anxiety. It can create avoidance of thoughts. I can't think about death. I don't want to do certain things. I don't want to go to the hospital. I don't want to go by a graveyard. I don't want to go anywhere that reminds me of death. Safety-seeking behaviors, just always being protective of yourself so that you don't get in a situation where you might die. Reassurance seeking from others, like, I called you half an hour ago and you didn't call me back, and then worrying that they've died, right? Or I haven't heard from you, they're probably dead, right? You all know people like this. Or you may even occasionally think that yourself. Risk-taking, sort of living in a sort of just throw everything to the wind type of way. Hypervigilance about death, emotional distress, of course. Fear of aging or illness, which I think manifests in different ways in our society, right? We're always trying to make it look like we're not getting older. I color my hair. Is that a fear of death? I don't know, maybe. Grief responses, but ongoing grief responses, right? Normal grief responses are fine. Delayed or reactive decision making, I'll say more about that in a minute. A sense of meaningless, despair. Hoarding wealth is actually, might be, I don't know what it's like after this, so in the meantime, I'm gonna gather up everything. Of course, we know what Christ said about that. Don't store up your treasures here, store up your treasures in heaven. For me, one way that I really see this, where it says delayed or reactive decision making, I'm thinking about medical decision making. And as a palliative care chaplain, I'm working with patients who are seriously ill, and so often I see folks who don't want to talk about it. They're afraid to decide something or other. They may pursue unnecessarily aggressive treatment, a treatment that's not curative, or kind of last-ditch efforts to do everything. I see this all the time, especially with my religious patients. There's been a lot of research that shows that patients who are somewhat religious tend to, if they don't have any spiritual care within the hospital, as part of the team, they tend to seek more aggressive, futile treatments, especially in the end of life, and they're less likely to seek hospice care. We know this.
Can you say that again?
Yeah. So basically, if you have a religious patient who self-identifies as religious, when they only, and I love clergy, when they only have their own clergy to talk to about this decision making, they tend to opt to do everything and keep pushing and trying and seeking curative treatments. But what we saw is that when patients who are religious, who also have as part of their medical care chaplains, who can sort of be part of the decision-making team and be part of the medical team and kind of speak the theological, spiritual language, but also understand the medical piece of it, that patients are more likely to choose more comfort-based care, oftentimes because they have this idea that I have to do everything because God wants me to do all the things, right? Or something like that. And so it's actually very interesting. Yeah, question?
I was just going to ask about the why. Why do you hypothesize that is? So
yes.
Does it make sense?
Yeah, it's Tracy Balboni's work, but I think basically most of it has to do with a false understanding that we need to be healed in this body at all costs, and be healed and seek healing and there's a lot of waiting for miracles. Do all the things until God gives us the miracle, always praying for full bodily healing and feeling like you have to pray for that. You can't pray for anything other than full bodily healing in this life. And to do so would be giving up, or not being faithful enough, or being, allowing death to happen, something like that. I don't really know exactly. We just did a grant proposal to do a study on it, so yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just touching on that.
Yeah, please. Yeah, I'd love to hear people's thoughts.
Either from Catholic backgrounds that I've encountered where the patient or the patient's family making a decision on their behalf has explicitly said, well, they're Catholic, they have to be full code.
Right,
And that's,
yeah.
I think it's poor catechesis
Yeah,
on that end.
right.
And I think on the other end, I see more of the Protestant side, a lot of more like faith and trust as
Yeah.
their rationale.
Yeah. I just keep thinking, like, even Lazarus died eventually, But it's just like...
Eventually.
Oh, what were you going to say? Twice, right. I don't really say that in like a family meeting because that'd be weird. But, it is interesting. And I can think of hospice patients where I went and they said, this person is like dying of metastatic tonsil cancer. You will only pray for full bodily healing, the end. And if you don't believe that, we don't want you in this house, which was really, and of course, I will pray for all the things, right? I'm not gonna, but at the same time, I also understand that sometimes fighting and then still dying can really be very distressing for the family. And they don't want to say goodbye. They don't want to talk about forgiveness. They don't want to talk about some of the wrapping it up end of life comfort things because they're so focused on they say Jesus didn't work miracles there because of their lack of faith. That's what people still quote to me all the time. They didn't do miracles, and so it's up to me, my faith, to make this miracle happen. And it's heartbreaking. It's a lot of pressure on the dying. It's a lot of pressure on the dying person. And also we put them in situations where they may have to be navigating more and more suffering, machines and, CVVH and being on Impella.
The real work that they
Right.
really
Yeah.
actually-
Right. So that's a whole other talk. Okay, so this is not my area of specialty, truthfully, in terms of like psychology and CBT and whatnot, but so some modern approaches to death anxiety would be like exposure therapy. So what that is, and maybe some of you can talk more about it, but it's basically just like do the thing that you're afraid of. So that means you would like go to funerals, you would go to a cemetery, you would learn about, you would just do things that expose you to, in small amounts, in a repeated way, to what you're most afraid of. And the idea is that over time, you will learn to regulate your response to that. Is that a relatively okay description of that? Okay. There's this thing that I read about called Theory A and Theory B, which is a CBT thing related to like health anxiety. So basically you say to yourself, the way you frame it is, it's horrible that we don't know what happens after death. And so you spend all your time Googling what happens after death. You watch videos about near-death experience. You try to read everything, and you go on and you're just obsessed with finding out what happens after death, right? But we don't. You're never going to do that, right? And so so framing it as theory A, theory B is instead the problem is that my fears and worries about not knowing what happens after death are overwhelming. So then you're able to address your fears and worries about the topic instead of the topic itself. That's the idea. And so you sort of hold these ideas and sort of gently play with them in your mind as you navigate this, and that's like a therapeutic technique. Swedish death cleaning. Have you ever heard of this? This is where you go through your whole house and you get rid of everything that you don't need and you give some of the meaningful things to people you love. And because it helps you start thinking about your life and what's meaningful and your loved ones. It's very powerful, and it's also very kind and loving to your loved ones, so they don't have to go through all your stuff later.
That's great for the individual.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of these, and these are not secular things that don't work. I think it's actually very helpful to understand these things. And of course, filling out your will or advance directive, just sitting down to do that. I put out on here the 5 wishes, which is something that probably you have seen, which is an advance directive that has some stuff around like, you know, life support, but also related to kind of the more psychosocial, spiritual things, like, I want these things read to me, I want this music, I want these people, this is the setting I would like. So it helps you kind of think through some of the non-medical things related to end of life. Another thing is, has anyone heard of death cafes? Okay. Death cafes are this movement. There's a whole website and they happen all the time. I've actually been to one, but it was this movement to talk about death. And you get together, and it's like 15 people, and you always have cake. So it's like cake or death, you know, that comedian. So you show up, and then literally all you do is you eat cake and drink tea, and you talk in an open-ended way about death.
Nice.
And keep it coming. I love a call and response. Yeah.
Potatoes.
Yeah. So, and I went to one, and it was really interesting. Although, of course, we all came from so many different worldviews, and so trying to like talk about it was just like herding cats. I felt like.
Did it get heated though? Does it get
No, it didn't get heated. But I'm not sure if it was helpful to me, but it might have been helpful to some other people. So, yeah, it's an interesting thing. Okay, I would love to know where do you encounter death anxiety in your own work, either with people that you're caring for or patients. Maybe let's just do a little small group discussions together just for like 5 minutes. Where does this come up for you? Like, why are you interested in this topic? Take it away. Thank you. I think we'll come back to the big group, if you don't mind. It's so hard to reel people back in. I love that there's conversations going. Yeah. Okay. We'll have more time to talk at the end too, if you want. Okay.
Are we still talking?
Yeah, I think we're gonna wrap it up. Okay. Unfortunately, you can't see this picture super well, but it's from Vespers on Holy Friday, where we take the body down from the cross, and we have the women, and we have like 4 women do that and bring that, and so this is me looking up at the cross, and then it's all of us. Sorry, you can't see too well. Yeah. So, okay, I'm going to back up for a second. I think I thought like about religiosity and death anxiety. Basically, like the more religious you get, the less you might have. What's interesting is actually most of the literature indicates that it's like this. So if you have no religious belief, you don't have much death anxiety. If you have some religious belief, you have a lot of death anxiety. And then if you have high religious belief, it goes low again. So it's curvilinear. So the highest death anxiety was expected among patients with an average centrality of religiosity. This is interesting to me. So I think, what do you all think about that? Like, does that surprise you? Does that make sense? Right. So people who might have like this much belief in or they, like the Catholic patients say, well, I'm Catholic. Maybe they don't really go to church, but they inherited kind of a very specific idea of what that means. To say, well, I'm Catholic, so I guess I have to do everything. I can't have hospice or palliative care because that's giving up. Or like, it's the same as euthanasia. Hospice is not the same as euthanasia, okay? Hello? But there's things where they kind of lump it all together. So I see it manifest in that way. Yeah, Mina.
I think it's a generalized phenomenon where if you understand something just enough,
Yeah.
that you're confused.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
When I see this, I think of it as a trust issue. Because I would love to, I'm sorry, I mean, I'm in this field, but sometimes it just gets me.
Of course.
Whew, it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
But if I allow myself to trust,
Yeah.
that's my hiccup.
Yeah.
And it's just.
Yeah. And I feel the same way. There are times when I'm very kind of comfortable, and I'm and then there are other times when like I was going to give a retreat about end of life, and I had like a total existential crisis because I was like, I don't even know what I'm talking about, because it just felt so overwhelming. But then I also have times again where I feel like I see God's presence. I feel like I can trust God. I really can align myself with what we believe. Yeah, so it's a process. And I think it's good that you're paying attention, right? It's good to get overwhelmed because at least you're not like a robot.
Great, but
Yeah.
it's in the private.
Yeah, and that's okay.
Look
Yeah.
at them in that mirror.
The
Yeah.
people I know who don't have any religious belief, no faith at all, have kind of spent their whole lifetime with this sort of desensitization of accepting,
Yeah.
when it's over, and
Right.
and they just kind of, that's just how it is. So it's not
Right.
a struggle for them.
Right. So I have like 3 short little examples of sort of non, medium, and high. So this was my patient, Andrea, I'll call her. She had end-stage liver disease from alcohol use. She was facing end of life. Dialysis was keeping her going. Her real problem was her liver, of course, but so it was sort of sustaining her, but it wasn't curative. She was not a religious person. She loved T.S. Eliot. She loved Madonna. And so basically, as she was reaching end of life, she knew this was her last dialysis treatment, so she knew that within 2 days she would be dying. And she looked at me and she was like, well, I'm calling all my family members, like, what should I do now? I'm like, so, Ira Byock's book, 4 Things That Matter Most. So it's basically a perfectly lovely framework for thinking about what you say to loved ones. So it's basically, forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, I love you. And so I said, well, sometimes people think of those categories. And she said, okay, that's good. Okay, so my mom, I'm gonna definitely say, I love you and thank you. My sister, I need to say forgive me to her. And also I need to say, I forgive you to her. And she kind of thought through all these things. Now, she didn't really not believe in God, and it was not something she wanted to talk about, but she was at peace. So that is what I witnessed. And when I said goodbye to her, I knew that I was saying goodbye and she was going to be actively dying the next time I saw her. And so she looked me straight in the eye and she said, thank you, I love you. I said, thank you, I love you, which I don't normally say to people, but I felt like saying it. And she said to me, after I die, I will whisper the poems of Walt Whitman in your ear. And she said, please read T.S. Eliot and Whitman to me when I'm dying, and also play Madonna. Which I was like, I'm not doing those at the same time, but okay. So, but I did read the poems, and then I turned on Madonna and left. But it was like, it was a very powerful experience for me because this woman was really not a religious person, but there was something in her, of course, to see her as an icon of Christ, and maybe, of course, this is all giant mystery, right? But I saw peace in her. I saw love and peace and acceptance. And it was beautiful for me to witness. And it helped my faith, even though she wasn't like a religious person. So, again, low religiosity can lead to greater distress. So people with low but not zero religiosity require special help because they can experience fear, anger, God abandonment, or a feeling of being punished by God. Being positively involved in religion can help the patient to distance themselves from their current problems, which I feel like is like a really weird thing to say, but okay. But these are doctors talking, so. This was not a chaplain. Sorry, Dr. Minas. No, yes. No, I just thought that was a very odd, that's like hilarious to me, but if anything, it's the opposite, right? But it also facilitates reflection on existential issues, returning to the most important, sometimes neglected values. So you may sort of have been skimming the surface of religiosity your whole life, and then suddenly it hits you like a ton of bricks, and then there's this like panic to figure out what you actually believe. So a good example of this was a patient, Elaine. She was a 60-year-old gyn-onc patient, ovarian cancer. She was facing end of life. She'd done multiple clinical trials. She was Greek Orthodox. She was somewhat religious. She was very Greek. She was like, she was like a Christmas and Easter Pascha Christian. She loved cooking. She loved her family. She loved Greek food. She had written a Greek cookbook. She was going through a new divorce, unfortunately. She was worried about her children's future. She told me that she had terror. That was the word she used. She said, I am terrified. And it was like, oh. And she tried everything. She threw the kitchen sink at her cancer to the point where I do think she was not quite able to do some of the work because so much of the treatments were had a lot of side effects and pain. what she said to me all the time was, why me? Why now? I was a good person and I don't deserve this. I would venture to say that as Orthodox Christians, we all think we are a good person or we're all not a good person. I mean, we might try to not use those categories, right? No one deserves anything, or we all deserve everything, right? I mean, we have all the things, right? Christ has done all the work, has done all the things. And so it's not because we deserve or don't deserve. This is not like good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. That is not a framework that we have. I mean, take a look around. You see awful people having a great long life and beautiful people dying too early. Of course, it's not about deserving, mostly. But for her to stay in this space was really hard. I did my best to talk with her and to navigate that. She definitely, I actually talked with her about compartmentalization a lot because she was just so overwhelmed. She couldn't talk a little. She could only talk like the full terror overwhelmed. And so I would kind of say so we use this image in palliative medicine of like the box. Basically, you put all your worries and fears and uncertainties and pain and this and that into this box. And then you put the top on and you put it over here and you just try to live your life. And then you take the box occasionally off the shelf and you open it and then you go there and then sometimes you put it back. It's sort of an image of compartmentalization that like secular medicine teaches. They teach this image to all the fellows navigating like with patients. The box it sort of worked, but it didn't really work with her. And I don't really know what happened to her ultimately. She went home on hospice, but I don't know what her end of life was like. Yeah, okay. And then finally, this wonderful patient, John, who is a 62-year-old with pancreatic cancer, which, as you know, pancreatic cancer diagnosis is actually enough for admission to hospice because of the severity. He was a devoutly Orthodox person. He was so sweet. He loved that I was an Orthodox chaplain. He freaked out. He had the sayings of the Desert Fathers on his bedside table and this and that. And he received bad news and he had a change in prognosis. So they knew he was not a candidate for any more disease-directed treatment. So he was going to elect home hospice. And he became bedbound. He was dependent for all his activities of daily living. He couldn't get up. He really couldn't do anything. And in the family meeting where we shared this with him, the physician was super worried about how he was going to react. He was like, oh God, he's not going to be able to deal with it. They're in denial, this and that. And so instead, after this, he sat there in the bed and he got this smile on his face and he said, well, now I will have lots of time to pray. Now I know it's coming, so I can prepare. And we all just stood there like, oh. But it was really amazing. That was what he said. He was like, what a gift. I can sit, I can't walk now, but I can sit and I can pray. And it was beautiful. And it taught the doctor a lesson of don't worry about, don't get ahead of yourself. Let yourself be surprised. And so that was really beautiful. And also just as a side note, religious coping comes in different forms, right? So this is something I present about, but there's positive religious coping and negative religious coping. It's a spectrum, right? So positive religious coping is like meditating. This is a more secular presentation I give, but brings me peace and helps me cope. And then there's this, God is punishing me and I deserve to suffer. So you take that and you sort of and therefore it translates into I don't need pain medication. I shouldn't accept comfort care. I should do all these crazy surgeries because I deserve to pile suffering upon myself. Or something positive might be, I'm praying for a miracle and I trust that God loves me. So I hope that I am healed and I know that God is present no matter what, right? Which to me is a very Orthodox worldview. Or we can't discuss goals of care. We can't talk about decision making because that's negative. That kind of magical thinking. If you say it, it will happen. So these are ways that it comes out in patients, so just to be sort of aware of it. So there's good religiosity and hurtful religiosity. Okay, so an Orthodox approach to death anxiety. So of course we start with Christ. we have to remember that this is such a cool icon from OCMC. It's Matthew 25. It says at the bottom, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was naked. And it's this sort of beautiful encounter between the people and Christ, to remember that whenever we encounter someone first, as the caregiver, Christ is the caregiver. The person that we visit is, or the visited, that's what it should say, the visited. The person that we visit, and of course the ultimate source of healing. So when I care for a patient, I can prayerfully try to remember that this is Christ in front of me, and that I can prayerfully, faithfully, humbly represent, embody the kindness and compassion of Christ for that person, but ultimately to keep perspective that it is not me doing the healing work. So how do we view death? Like, how do we think about death? Is it fine? Is it something to be feared? So we pray for a Christian ending to our lives, painless, blameless, peaceful, and a good defense before the dread judgment seat of Christ. In the Liturgy of Death, Father Alexander Schmemann writes that death was not created by God. It is not, in the emphatic sense of the word, a natural event. It is a tragedy on the deepest level, for God created us not that we should die, but in order that we should live. St. Paul also characterized death as an enemy. For he must reign till he has put all enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be destroyed is death. Okay, so death is not, it's an enemy. There's something unnatural about it in a certain sense, right? At the same time, death is a victory. So it's really, as with many things in our faith, it's kind of this dialogue and Venn diagram of many things. So death is a tragedy. Death is a victory because Christ has trampled down death by death. And death is our source of hope, the dawn of the mystical day, as it says in one of our liturgical prayers. So when we think of death, it's a tragedy, but it's a blessing from God. It's a gift, an expression of his mercy and compassion. And as we sing, of course, Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. So, hold on. So, and I want to say, too, that this is different than, well, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but I think there's different, like back in the day, death was around, you'd walk with the body in the home, the wake would be in your home, you saw death a lot, it was sort of part of life. And then there was this swing, denial of death kind of piece where we don't want to think about it, we sanitize it, we make it, in the funeral homes. And then it kind of swings back to, I think in some ways now, people are like, there's a movement to like embrace death in a certain sense. These natural deaths and burials and death cafes and all these kinds of things where it's like, death is part of life. It's totally natural. Yes, but not really, right? It's both an enemy and a triumph. It's never just fine, right? And the only way that it is fine is when we think about Christ's death and resurrection, and that for us, and that is how we can think about it. Trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. So, there are some ways I'd like to think. How are we doing on time? 10 minutes. Oh, yikes, okay. Okay, we're gonna whip through here. Okay, so pendulum. I love this image of a pendulum. So basically, one way, sort of how we can navigate death anxiety. One would be sort of extreme fear and avoidance, never thinking about it, never talking about it. I don't wanna deal with that. I asked my husband, I was like, what do you think about when you think about death? Are you like, does it freak you out? And he goes, I don't want to talk about that. He didn't even want to talk about talking about it. But he's fine. He was sort of joking. And then there's sort of the other thing, which is like embracing and normalizing death. Obsession with death, skulls, and I live near Salem, Massachusetts, where it's all like death and skulls and Halloween and weird, lack of reverence for what death is. And also, I would say it adds to a culture that encourages medical aid in dying, because death is something we can control. It's something that we should just go ahead and choose and kind of navigate it, make decisions about it, and use it and be in charge of it, right? We can just take over death. For us, we want to be in the middle, right? We want to have this prayerful remembrance of death. We don't want to avoid it, but we don't want to obsess about it all the time either, right? And we see that in the person of Christ and in our practices. So again, it's a practice. It's something we do over and over. And there are times when we're going to be bad at it and times when we're going to be awesome. We can look at scripture. St. Paul says, I die daily. Romans, for whether we live unto the Lord, and whether we die unto the Lord. Whether we live, therefore, or die, we are the Lord's. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. I pray for that a lot with my patients, the peace that surpasses understanding. I really pray to experience that. And I think when I don't know what to pray for, I pray for the peace that surpasses understanding, I think. Liturgy. So here we are venerating the epitaphion, something, what's the word? Yeah, the bier where the tapestry. So the primary question in liturgy is never what do we think about this, but rather what is being revealed to us? The core question of liturgical theology. How is our very vision and understanding informed and transformed by that experience? So this tells us that we need to take a minute and think about Christ when he has been taken down from the cross, and take a moment and venerate him and pray together. We don't just sort of sweep it under the rug and arrive at Pascha. We take time with our bodies, not just our minds, our physical body, to walk up, to pray, to do prostrations. Everything's involved. Liturgy teaches us, okay, by the way, it's not the coolest picture ever. That's my baby when he got baptized. And Veseritas. So, but, this could be another presentation unto itself. But there's so many pieces in liturgy that teach us how to lament, teach us how to hold joy and sorrow, how to show up, how to stay present, stand at the foot of the cross and just stand there for a million hours, even though it's really hard and you're tired and you don't want to think about it right now. But it encourages us to do that with our bodies, right? In baptism, it's a death. It's a death to the old self, and we put on Christ. And when we witness a baptism, we, again, sort of relive that death to self and putting on Christ. Every time we receive communion, it's like the famous quote, St. Simeon, I who am straw now partake of fire. But that sense of constant repentance, constant confession, turning to God, and being together. So there's all these ways that death is woven into our practice. Holy Week, again, listen to all the prayers of Holy Week, especially the Lamentation service. Just pray that service. And I mean, I do think, there's power in naming things, right? So the church knows that there's power in praying and naming your fears, your emotions, your lament, your confusion. How, O life, canst thou die? Right? I mean, that I can relate to that feeling, and I think we all can. And there's in many monasteries, they have an ossuary where they have the bones of the people who have died there. I remember going to a monastery in Ormilia in Greece, and they brought me into the ossuary, and the nun was like, here's Sister Marina. She's so patting her skull. And I was like, whoa. It's, sorry, but it was just, wow. I mean, it was very, wow, okay, this is new for me to see all the nuns there and with the skulls, and they write their name on the skull and their bones are there. And it was just incredibly powerful, but it gave me pause because that was something I had never really seen before, and it was very beautiful.
Seen it with the pictures.
Yeah, I know. This is from a monastery, I think in Russia. But self-reflection, I'm just going to have you take this home, the life review form. But of course, we need to think for our own selves about our own lives. So I included this life review thing, which is basically just a reflection on how your life is going and what you want to work on and what you want to think about. And so we're not going to do that right now. And also, of course, to me, the main thing, one of the main things that we can do to practice the remembrance of death is to visit the sick and visit the dying and visit your loved ones in the hospital or professionally be caring for the dying, but to expose yourself, right? Caring for the dying, this liturgy of Holy Week, it's like the OG exposure therapy is like liturgy, right? It's just thinking about encountering this over and over and making it more normal. Learning how to be with someone who's dying can help you, hopefully. as Dr. Rossi likes to always say after Bishop John, all is well because the tomb is empty. And in the interest of time, we're just going to lean right into this. Enjoy ye all the feast of faith. Receive ye all the riches of loving kindness. Let no one bewail his poverty, for the universal kingdom has been revealed. Let no one weep for his iniquities, for pardon has shone forth from the grave. Let no one fear death, for the Savior's death has set us free. Every time yeah, I know, woo! And so to me, this is, O death, where is your sting? Hell, where is your victory? Christ is risen, and you are overthrown. And so to me, let no one fear death, for the Savior's death has set us free. I just try to repeat that to myself. And hopefully this will come across. I don't know if you can hear it, but I'm going to turn it up and see if it works. Hold on, let's see.
With the Batman shirt.
That's what I was going to say.
My little baby Batman when he was 4. Yeah. So, do we have any time for a little bit of discussion? Yeah, we have 2 minutes.
Well, it's beautiful at the end there, just having your son kind of proclaiming that, because that's something we can give to our children as well, is we can expose them to Christ's victory over death. And then it's not something to be feared throughout life. And if you're exposed to that even from childhood, you have that much more courage through life.
I hope so. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yes, I would love to hear your perspective.
Following Father Sampson's talk and the discussion of tension, holding things in tension.
Yes.
For those of you here, if you've ever been with someone who's critically ill or dying, and you have priests, plural, maybe 7, gathered for the service of unction, there is this paradox, problem, tension, etc. between healing and dying. And sometimes it can be awkward when those prayers are read and you're present. Say it's a close friend, or let's say you're a parish council member, and obviously, since you're a parish council member, you go with the priest, or priests multiple, to the hospital to be with them when the unction service is being served. Obviously, a parish council member, sure you do that.
Yes.
Other than just bringing donuts to church. It's not to criticize, by the way, it's to extend the perspective. And you will notice there is this tension, there's this problem that we experience in praying for someone who's critically ill and dying, and you're praying, the words of the service talk about healing, they talk about perfect healing, and we do anoint people before death at some stage in that process, and so you're going to encounter that. And sometimes you're going to have these, you yourself will experience this kind of, what do you do with that? Do you have anxiety about that? Does it make you feel uncomfortable, etc., when you're with them? So there's something for you to reflect on going forward.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm wondering about, is there differences in how you approach this? If instead of maybe an older person after a chronic illness, it's the family of a child who's been hit by a drunk driver who is now brain dead?
Would someone else like to answer? Pediatric chaplain?
I mean, what's the question? Is it
just,
different?
Yeah,
I mean,
so how do you navigate the different life stages or the tragedy of it versus sort of like this is a natural part?
That's multifaceted because there are resources out there also about like the trauma and the complicated grief of like a traumatic death.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's a much different reading process. I mean, if it's a trauma and someone dies suddenly, they have not done any preparation. I mean, perhaps some, if they're an adult, like they might have a will or something.
I mean, I think part of it obviously is no matter what, I mean, for any
person, no matter who you are or where you are, to acknowledge the tragedy of that, to acknowledge the difficulties, to be present in that, to never just sort of say like, leave more, or, you know, work hard, right?
All is well.
But, yeah, right.
And you still have those complications.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of what Sarah said also can work in that setting. I mean, if a patient has been declared dead by neurological criteria, you still have opposition to, you know, stopping mechanical ventilation. I mean, for the same reason, but like give them time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
I just want to highlight that everything's the same and everything's different. Everything's the same because even though I don't deal with death, thank God, I don't think it's a triviality that people are in pain. You know, they come and say, oh, my shoulder hurts. And it's not like, well, at least you're not dying. That's why they're there. You know, shoulder hurts, they're anxious, they're depressed, you know, they want to talk about their taxes, like whatever it is that this person is coming to you for as a professional is your responsibility. So they're all the same. And
It may be absolutely changing their life, but they can't function.
Right.
They can't pick up their kid. They can't do their job.
It's significant to them.
It's
Right?
significant to them.
Let's say they're perfectly normal, right? Like their shoulder's perfectly normal.
Right.
It's causing them distress on some level.
Yeah.
I can't just dismiss that distress because it doesn't rise to the level of concern that I would have. No, it's concerning to them. And they say, oh, you know, is this a bad problem? I'm like, there's no good problems. Right? Every problem. That's why you're here. If you didn't have a problem, you wouldn't be here. So let's figure out why you're here and what we can do to honor that. So everything's the same. And everything's different because it's not going to be, oh, I've seen this before. Like, yeah, I've dealt with many different people with traumatic brain injuries, and I'm an expert in this. But right, this specific instance of this traumatic brain injury is unique and worthy of my full undivided attention as a unique case. Even though like on paper it looks exactly the same as every other case I've ever. No, you've never seen this before. This is the first time you've ever seen this. So
It's like, it's like the one sheep and the 99. It's like
Right.
this person matters. This individual person is the icon of Christ in front of us, and this person matters to God, and they're suffering. Yeah.
So to answer your question, like, do you deal with it differently? Yes and no.
Yes.
You're going to deal with it differently because it's always different, and no, because every case, no matter how you're dealing with it, is going to have that same icon of Christ approach that Sarah presented to us, regardless of whether you're dealing with a stubbed toe or, you know, pancreatic cancer and everything.
And I think we probably are supposed to wrap it up, but I just
Yeah, I was
want
going
to
to
say,
wrap you up at 12:15, and then I was like,
Okay.
that's a great question. We should discuss
well, I
it.
just really appreciate you all being here, and you know, I
Thank
hope
you
that
so
continue
much.
to
That was
bring
really
a
nice.
friend next year to this conference.
Yes!
I feel like this year it's
That's your
really
homework.
good. Everyone needs to bring one friend, and then we
Actually, I don't know if we have the capacity for everyone. Everyone
Up to
agree
one
with
friend.
one other person on one person that you're going to bring
Casey?
together.
Yeah.
And if we want to learn more
Yeah.
about some of your things,
Yeah.
or books that we should look at, or.
Oh, my book, yeah.
What is your
I
book?
wrote a book. It's called Memory Eternal, Living with Grief as Orthodox Christians.
Oh,
And
nice.
it is ancient faith. And actually some of the stuff where I talk about like how we think about death and liturgy stuff, I actually go much more into the death and liturgy grief stuff in my book. So, and there's a bereavement curriculum at the back. So some people have been doing bereavement groups. So if you do one, please let me know.
And do you
Thank you.
do speaking engagements
Yes,
as well?
I've been doing some grief retreats and stuff. And yeah, so I'm happy to come out to your parish anytime.
Next spring 25.
You can take that home.
So did you
She's
tell them?
Yeah, the
Where?
life review form,
In
just if you'd
Virginia?
like to fill it out and use it as a tool for
I'm
self-reflection,
in
please
Chicago,
enjoy.
St. Helena, Los Niles. You guys know it? Yeah.